Well, welcome to Collateral Banter, episode 37. Gerry comes back to the show.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Our conversations on Baudrillard, very popular, all right? My regular shows, it gets a couple downloads. But yours is in the hundreds. I just want to say that. Hundreds. All right. The first conversation you and I had in August of last year, reaching the 1,000 mark.
Wow, that's amazing.
I don't know what that means. And when I talk about Baudrillard by myself, when I'm reading his books, I also get into the hundreds.
Yeah, no, it's definitely good stuff. And if you compare it with like the academic work that I normally do, altogether, I have like about 1,000 citations ever across everything I've ever written. So this is a great way to really reach an audience.
It's true. I think a lot of academics are still afraid of this medium because it doesn't bring the same respectability within the field. It's so democratized that anybody, like me, I could just grab a mic and just start recording anywhere, and it has yet to penetrate, I think, the halls of academia. But some are picking up on it, and some are willing to talk, like you. Come on and share your insights in Baudrillard. So I appreciate it. Appreciate you coming on, taking some time. Okay, so we want to talk about Baudrillard and his book, America.
Yes.
For the episode. And I was reading this a couple days ago. I looked today to see when this book was published. And 1988. I was 4 years old at that time. And everything I read here is so accurate about America today. And we can talk about that if you like, just how prescient his writing is about American and the reality that we exist in today. The relationship between primitive society. And it was interesting, and it was maybe page 7 that I saw this. It was, America is the last primitive society. And I was like, okay, let me take note of that. Let me ask Gerry about what that means. And how is it that America, in maybe Baudrillard's analysis, is the last primitive society? What did that mean to you?
I think you make some very important points in framing our conversation, right? First of all, this is late 80s. So by now, Baudrillard was very well established as a writer, very well known, certainly in Europe and in the United States. What's really interesting is that this particular book, we could consider it a flop. It was one of the coldest receptions that among the books that he ever wrote. You know, many people thought that, he didn't get it at all, right? He didn't get what America is about. It actually received a lot of criticism from different fronts, right? Like one, for instance, was that there is no conversation in the book directly of racial equality. And some people saw it as he's not paying attention to the important issue. I actually think quite the opposite. I think he's building an archetype for analyzing a society from the highest vantage point, right? So I think that makes the book very, very interesting. And I'm glad that you went directly to this quote of like the primitive society, right? Like the last remaining primitive society. I think a couple of pages later, maybe this all comes more into focus when he refers to America being the primitive society of the future. Right. So it's not just the last primitive society in the world, but a primitive society of the future. And this, since I was 7 years old when this was published, right? So, of course, this takes me back to Epcot Center.
Right.
And I think
it's the utopia.
Many of these themes that we see in America, in a way, can also be identified in Disney's Epcot Center, right? And this idea of American society being kind of the model of a society of the future. I think this quote of the primitive society, and I think he explains it to some extent, right, is this notion that primitive societies are connected to their history and their culture only through myth and magic. That's how I make sense of it. And I think from that perspective, it is absolutely true. I think if we look at the curriculum in social studies in American schools, we see that if you go through the traditional school system in the United States, you relate to the history of this country only through myth, right? Not through fact, not through history, not through any more what we might consider sophisticated method, but in reality we tend to relate to America through myth. And I
Right.
think that's what he's referring to. I also think this idea of a primitive society also has to do with a primordial society, right? And I
Mm.
think the analysis that he presents is so broad that you can only look at primordial elements. I think in a way he's trying to distill a recipe for what would constitute American culture that would transcend. And I think here there is a paradox. He often refers to the banality of American culture, the superficiality of American culture. And at the same time, his analysis is presenting all these different elements that make for very timeless analysis of American society based on these basic elements.
When you were talking about that, I was looking here at what he wrote. He called it America is neither dream nor reality, it is a hyper reality. And then he said America is a giant hologram in the sense that information concerning the whole is contained in each of its elements. It's interesting when you talk about it because I think of, and these are the topics that he discusses throughout this book, are California, Las Vegas, Santa Barbara, Epcot Center. It's like he is taking this and really forming a understanding of America before I think Americans understood America, because people now accept it. Now that there is a Trump election, the conquest of social media in our daily lives, and people going through these routines. But he saw this in 1988. And I think that that's the amazing part before the technological developments that we've had, just to see how America was in many ways shaped by these dreams, like you said, and this hyper reality construction. Its own culture, identity, its power. It is, I think, very accurate. And the fact that his book, like you said, wasn't getting a lot of press is a bit surprising that people weren't taking it seriously. However, I want to say he does discuss differences, and I want to ask you about that later. But actually, related to differences, he discusses something very interesting about sex, how previous characters like Boy George, Michael Jackson, and David Bowie from previous generations were about like these explosive public figures, and they were figures of sex and pleasure. And then I think now he's looking at it and saying that's gone. That sort of explosive sexual pleasure figure is been eliminated. Now it's this sort of, not very specific terms, but sort of says maybe this is a postmodern sexual liberation, gender fluidity, without the sex and pleasure of the figures that used to his. He wrote in a really interesting part, a post-orgy world. If it's happening in America, and you take that analysis of America, capital, empire, and dominance of the world, it almost feels like what was happening in America and that Baudrillard could see in 1988 has spread almost everywhere else around the world. You know, I was thinking about this sort of sexless, differentless individuals in terms of even Japan. The fact people aren't having children, aren't having sex at all. I think it's just so fascinating. You could see this for a large part. But is there anything you'd like to add? How did you understand maybe that part about like differences? And there are parts where he talks about these differences, but he doesn't discuss the sort of racial composition of America. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're identifying two very important themes, right? I think the theme of sex and sexuality is really important to him in America and in other writings. So one of these ideas, right? He takes the idea of sexual liberation one step further, right? So he's talking about sexual liberation not as the free expression of sexuality, but as becoming free of sex, right? So he kind of suggests this idea that sex is everywhere except for sex, right? So I think he's referring to some form of sublimation or transcendence, right? He plays, for instance, with the word transsexual. And he has an essay that is titled, "We All Are Transsexuals Now." And he's not referring, of course, to transgender individuals. He's referring to a new level of sexuality in which we are liberated from sex, right? That sexuality is expressed through everything. And that can be fashion, it can be, and he seems to be fascinated with this idea of Boy George, right? So makeup and identities and so on. So that's really, really interesting to me, right? This idea. And I think he sees in American culture the archetype of this sexual pleasure outside of sex. I mean, this was all happening around the time of the first sexy Calvin Klein advertised, right? So then sexuality is in music and in advertisement and in popular culture. So what he's playing with is this idea that sex has been liberated from sex itself, right? So everything is sexual except for sex itself. So that's a very interesting idea. I think we have only taken this further in the decades since this was written, or since he was writing about it. So definitely a very important idea, one that he devoted a lot of time, which takes us to this idea of the orgy. And in fact, that passage or that story of what are you doing after the orgy appears in several of his books. Certainly it appears in America. I'm pretty sure it appears in one of the Cool Memories books, and there are several of those, so that's a full series. And it's very interesting, right? Because the idea is that, here the orgy is not understood only as a sexual manifestation or exercise, right? But what happens when you have everything? And that's certainly something that is striking about American culture. I remember one of my first conversations when I moved to the US, and I was talking with a friend from India, and we were joking about how overwhelming options in America were, right? Like it's impossible to order coffee because if you want milk, then, well, do you want milk? Do you want 1%, 2%, skim milk, cream? Do you want non-dairy milk? When you have still a fresh perspective of American culture, this idea of the post-orgy culture or post-orgy society comes through, right? It's easier to understand it from that point of view. And I think he writes both in America and in other parts that contemporary society is about having choices, but you are never free not to choose, right? Like you have a lot of freedom. You have more freedom than ever to choose something, but you have to choose. And in a way that becomes constraining itself.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Because not choosing is not an option. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, participating is compulsory, right? And that's another piece, another concept that he seems very interested in, this idea of you have to be connected to the network. And this was before internet, right? So he's not talking about being online, but he's referring to being connected to this larger society.
I thought it was interesting in that same chapter he was talking about sex and identity. He, a few paragraphs afterwards, shifts to U.S. and he talks about the war in Vietnam. And I thought this was a really interesting discussion. But he goes and says, America fights with two essential weapons, air power and information. That is the physical bombardment of its enemy and the electronic bombardment of the rest of the world. And these are non-territorial weapons, while the Vietnamese weapons and all of their tactics were products of people and its territory. So that is an interesting combination of what you're saying, but in the act of war. And he concludes in the Vietnam War that both sides won. The Vietnamese won on the ground, but the U.S. won in what he titled electronic mental space. It's interesting. He says, one side won with the ideological and political victory, Vietnam, and the other made apocalypse now. And that has gone right around the world. So in many ways, he's saying even in a war, America can still win because the war is almost being disseminated to the world of American power, American vision, American superiority. And even though you might lose the ground, in some ways, you're winning people's, I don't know if it's respect or fear for enemies, but people elsewhere are sort of like, dazed by it. But also, in many ways, and he talks about this afterwards, about how American culture begins also in this period during Vietnam to make it spread around the world, right? People start dressing like Americans in Europe. It's the pants, it's the bell bottoms, it's the dances, it's the music. And so I'm not saying that the war is necessarily linked to everything else per se, but it is interesting that you can fight this war physically on the ground and lose it and yet still gain sort of a soft power, a cultural hegemony over the world. You think about that in the research you've done about Baudrillard, about like that sort of relationship to war and the United States?
Something that's really striking, and I hadn't thought about it until I heard you say this, was this idea that kind of the mediatization of war is definitely a theme that is important to Baudrillard. I didn't, until rereading America and this conversation, only until now I had realized that this is such an early realization, because there are a couple of other moments that maybe help us draw a line here. The other two moments are the Gulf War, and he wrote a few essays, right, where he describes the Gulf War as the first war that happened in real time. And, it coincided with the 24-hour news networks, right? So CNN, and you could turn your TV at any given time and get information about what was happening in the war. Another moment much later, and this was toward the end of his life, was what he called this war porn and violence porn around the Abu Ghraib prisoners and the way they had been treated in such inhuman ways. But I think this connection, right, of war and media had been a theme, but I hadn't realized until now that it starts so early on, right? And definitely, you are correct in that there is a control of the narrative. I think whether or not people remember the coverage of war in '68, people remember the movies, right? A whole boom of movies about the Vietnam War, right? In many ways, we can't imagine probably one of the archetypes of American culture around the world, Rambo,
Right.
without understanding this war, right? So I think just that example suggests that you can rewrite history if you control media.
If you control media. And it's interesting, the movies can be about the wars that you are fighting as well, right? There are many well-made, great movies about the Vietnam War, Deer Hunter and other things like that, Full Metal Jacket. I mean, it's interesting how like you can still sort of retell the story through media years later and begin to shape hearts and minds abroad of people who might not have been alive in 1968, but who then can begin to interpret and understand the war through popular culture. It's so fascinating, man. And in fact, he was able to get this, just still blows me away. But I wanted to come back to, you mentioned before the sort of Epcot Center and Disney. What do you think Baudrillard would think if he were alive today and I were to take him to Las Vegas? What do you think Baudrillard would say about Las Vegas?
I think he would love it in the most morbid way. I think he probably would argue that Las Vegas is the pinnacle of American culture. I mean, certainly there was in America, he refers to this trip in the desert, right? And there's clearly a fascination with it. Also with the artificiality of American culture. And I think in many different respects, Las Vegas reflect, right, some of the points that he's most fascinated and most taken with American culture. I think that's a great question. I think in many ways, Vegas is like this idea of something completely hyper real, but taken, to the next level, right? Like in some ways, if Epcot Center and Disney altogether are kind of like the small scale project, and it's by no means a small scale project, then Vegas is its culmination. But also the other aspect that both share is the reconstruction, the hyper-real reconstruction of the world,
Mm.
right? Because in Vegas you have both Paris and Egypt and every other like major like historical
Landmark.
whole, yeah. And the same thing, right? Like you have this like pavilion of like different cultures. And I've always loved how the world, like, but what's really fascinating about Epcot Center is that it is not only a reflection of American culture, it kind of shaped how we understand the world and how we relate to the world, right? Because if you look at the layout of Epcot Center, kind of the international pavilions, you have all of these pavilions of different countries that are kind of connected harmoniously with each other. The US always is at the center, and all geographical references are lost,
Right.
right? Because it doesn't matter, we're just dealing with stereotypes that we have created of different countries,
It,
right? And the majority of the world is completely ignored.
right. And it reminds me of wrestling. I got into this show that's about women wrestling.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how people take on the role that the audience sees them through. So, like, a black woman is labeled the welfare queen. She's the opposite of that in life. But she adopts that reality to be part of this wrestling show. And then, like, the American Beauty, she's blonde
Mm-hmm.
and beautiful, and everybody sees her as a lead. And her life is, I mean, just so messed up, her life.
Yeah.
But people don't see that, right? They just see the blonde with the makeup and the beauty. She's good looking, and everybody's like, oh, she's so amazing. We love her. We always want her to win. So I just think of Baudrillard and like wrestling, not like the ultimate fighting, but the other
Yeah.
wrestling. Yeah, the WWE.
Mm-hmm.
I have to ask you this because it's, mostly about politics. And I thought it was really interesting that at the end of the book, or towards the end, Baudrillard talks about Ronald Reagan. And he titles the chapter The End of U.S. Power. And you've touched this on a little bit, but I find it interesting, a couple of things.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about Ronald Reagan. And if we think about it, this is the beginning of the mass media movement. 1988 is the end of Ronald Reagan's second term. He was the governor of California. He used to be an actor, right? It's like when you look back at American history, you shouldn't be too surprised about the current affairs and how we got to this point because the seeds were planted decades ago. I would argue a little bit with Baudrillard. And while I think Ronald Reagan is an excellent collection of America, I think it starts with John Kennedy. Like that's the beginning turn where he wrote here in this chapter. He writes something about people stop necessarily critiquing government and it becomes about images count alone. And to me, it's fascinating to see how John Kennedy in front of the camera is a lot more appealing than those who did not have a television and listened to the radio and who thought Nixon did better in the very first debate that happened between Nixon and Kennedy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, to me, it is, and again, John Kennedy was a young, charismatic guy, but it's also because he fit that era of television, of beginning this sort of mass communication. But I think he's right in that Reagan is this, coalescing figure of this media spectacle. I was blown away because I study politics and he doesn't really see as U.S. as an empire anymore. It sort of is an empire without a center, he talks about. And if where it's sort of been dispersed all around the world. And in some ways, America isn't leading that empire. And yet, at the same time, it is in almost full control of the world and of empire. It's almost reached the stage of global conquest without it having to be holding the world at the center. In America's palm, it sort of knows the world will fall into its orbit. And you talked about this last time we chatted, about sort of resistance to power and imperialism. Yeah. But I don't know if you want to say anything about that or add anything. Also, it's interesting, he talks about U.S. superiority, but at the same time, what gives America power is it's also its ability to have the world watch the show Dallas. And I thought that was interesting too. So it's a really interesting connection between Baudrillard and those in political science that talk about soft power. And unlike military interventions, how soft power is really this changing force around the world. It's blue jeans and music that can take down empires and not the military and tanks.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Is there anything you're thinking of while I say all of that?
You're absolutely right. I think maybe the unintended theme of today's episode is really this idea of things started earlier than we tend to think about, right? So you're completely right. The reference to Reagan makes a lot of sense, but I also think, as you said, Kennedy was perhaps the first real-time president, right? Or the first mediatized president. If nothing else, I don't think anybody has not seen, images of his assassination, right? Like that's probably one of the most, we could even perhaps argue that's the first viral video in history in some ways. And I think you're right. I always like to read whatever Baudrillard wrote about Le Pen during his time and about Reagan, and then what happens if we replace the names for Trump, and how many of the things would fit with the reality that we see today. I think if we take that analysis seriously, Trump is a lot less an anomaly and much more the logical consequence of this path that we've been into for decades now, right? That we shouldn't be surprised that he's president. And if anything else, I think it invites a conversation of what should we be preparing for in the future?
Right.
If we take this kind of long-term analysis, because I think there are some very interesting learning opportunities here.
Right.
So that's one of those aspects. Now, in relation to soft power, I think in a way what Baudrillard argues here, and by the way, the chapter ends, or the title of the chapter ends with a question mark, right? So, in a way, I think he's playing with the idea, well, is this really the end of American empire? I think this is kind of half serious, half joking. But I think in relation to this, what we can see is that American empire is less looking like an empire and more like a pandemic. And I think he plays with this idea of things going viral. And I think because the way viruses work is that they inject, right? They enter the DNA and they transform it, right? And I think that analogy is more fitting, right? So it's not necessarily that politicians in Washington are controlling the narrative or pulling the strings. I think they certainly are trying to do that, but I think with a high level of frustration. Because yes, blue jeans and American culture, but the problem is when that gets viralized and gets spread, we no longer have any control about how it is reimagined or reinterpreted. So yeah, I think the expansion piece is happening, but the control piece is not happening. Right? Because we don't have control over what aspects of American culture other societies are adopting or what sense they are making of, because there is a lot of room here for reimagining, reinterpreting, and even using in ironic ways some of these cultural manifestations.
Absolutely. You asked, maybe we need to be investigating what the future should hold. I just want to mention in my previous episode where I talked about economic turbulence, I began making connections to this data and information society that we're so saturated in. And I compared it in many ways to slavery. And what I was trying to get at is that the future of economic production is human thought, human genetics, human blood, right? And that is the future of where this model is going. And Baudrillard, I think if he was here hearing our conversation, he would be nodding his head in agreement. When you begin to see these type of commercials, not only for medications, but for genetic 23andMe and coding, it is this full totality of human life The way I've always understood capitalist production of things, it started in farming, you had the factories, and then the academy began to write about post-industrial societies. It was a service economy initially, right? Everything was about service. How can I serve you? And then I think now there is this new era of this technological revolution that a lot of people in Silicon Valley and the business world are writing about. If I can extrapolate out into the future, the things that we're going to have to be discussing in the future are bioethics, genetics, cloning, human cloning specifically. These are the type of questions that our institutions just aren't made for. They were made for some, slight social change, spend a little bit more on healthcare, on education, infrastructure, or not spend at all and like that. So I think our inability to appreciate science, and I mean science's intersection with economics and economic production, right? And where that is leading, especially in a society like America, which unlike the Europeans has a lot less regulation. So in America, you can get a guy like Mark Zuckerberg almost do whatever he wants with data, come around, apologize, nothing consequently happened to him. And it's interesting to see a society like Europe still have a very robust technological sector, maybe not as large or powerful as the United States, but the government there is trying to manage this production of data and information and technology, or at least maybe steer it towards some human ends that are humanistic, have humanistic ends possibly. It's funny when I bring up a lot of these, what I just told you, to activists who are like socialists or anarchists and stuff like this, they just look at me like I'm crazy. Like they give me a legit look, like the things I was just talking, the bioethics and the science and all that production. Because I also think this is a criticism of the left, which I very much love in my heart, but they're still stuck in the 20th century sort of Marxist production of the factories. If we control the factories, we'll bring about some sort of socialist utopia. And I think that you've now seen the direction and production of this society has already leapfrogged that. Not only through service, but through science. And so I think who controls data is important now. And not only that, but who gets to regulate your genetic coding, your medications, the scientific production that your body emits every day. Now that's a big loaded question, but is there any part that you want to add to that, or you think I'm wrong, or you think?
Oh, I agree. And not only I agree, I think kind of like the discussions that we've had kind of opened the door for continuing this conversation, right? Some of the last three books that Baudrillard wrote dealt precisely with this. He became obsessed with Dolly, the first cloned sheep.
Yeah.
Like he wrote almost an entire book about it. He surely was interested, and I think he was going in the direction that you are going precisely, right? The governing of the biosphere, right, and DNA information. And I think it goes back to the beginning of our conversation, this idea of sexuality being liberated from sex, right? And he says, well, now kind of in the past we had thought about liberation or sexual liberation was the decoupling of reproduction and sexuality, right? Because, it legitimized sex for pleasure and so on. But now he says, well, we've taken this to a whole new level, which is now reproduction is independent from sex, right? So this kind of cuts both ways, right? So he went into all of this research around making sense of cloning, and in many ways, I think this biological control is certainly one of the directions that we need to look into.
Yeah.
Right. I think what you describe very appropriately, right, is that because this is stepping outside of the traditional discussions of political economy that many of our activist friends, right, are involved with, it becomes not as appealing for them to engage with. And nevertheless, I think it's one of those areas that we all need to spend more time thinking about.
Right. And in fact, I just add two quick areas. I think also us becoming a society that lives on multiple planets is another issue. I mean, it will change us, that there will be people of our race born in Mars, likely, or on the moon in some colony. We don't see that yet concretely. However, all the markers are that is where we're headed. In 10 to 20 years, we'll be on we'll have things growing on Mars and the moon. And so you've begun to see this full production of society. And the only reason I compared it to slavery, I'm not saying that they're making slaves out of us. And I think that when people hear that, maybe that's what they thought I was implying, but that's not. But in many ways, production of slaves oftentimes depended on, they were analyzing their bodies, their minds, and they gave those certain values. That's all I was sort of implying in the episode, right? Was like, if you were muscular and 6'4" and strong built, right? Your body, they assessed that in that era. And I'm not even talking about the US necessarily, but they were assessing that and saying your value to the guy who's going to buy essentially your body is going to pay a lot more than if somebody is sick and ill from the trip that killed nearly 10 million slaves. 20 million came over and 10 million died on the way over. Estimates and things, the numbers might be off. Maybe it was 10 million and 5 million died. But many could not make the trip over. They didn't care. But those who could survive in many ways determined on what their body types were, when they're on genetics. So that's all I was saying. I was just comparing two things. And I think that is where this level of production is going. I just wonder what human beings can do collectively towards social change or pressuring this system to go towards sort of humanistic ends. And I'll just leave it at that, just because I don't think we all agree on what the humanistic ends are. But we know that if we don't push it at all, it will go towards its current ends. Environmental devastation, massive income inequality, oppression of people of color, oppression of poor people of color, and those things, right? It's like, if you cannot fight this system, you have to fight it in such a way that you not only fight it, but you have to almost push it towards different production, different social controls that no longer oppress people. I don't know what that looks like, because last time you were talking about sort of resistance and fighting empire was very localized, and it oftentimes limited people's visions to what you can do besides resisting maybe empire through violence. But it sort of doesn't lead a future, doesn't have a vision or a project. But I don't know if you want to add some closing remarks regarding that, and then.
Yeah, well, I think this idea of what makes us human is important, right? And this is going to mean different things to different people. But I think it's important then, if we are anticipating that this is the next wave of oppression, right? Like the decoupling of human DNA and information and biological characteristics from people's histories, lived experiences, connections with others, relationships, and so on, then maybe one of the things that we could all do, right, in addition to the spectrum of resistance that you just described, would be to resist any effort to separate humanity from the complexity of our stories, our suffering. A different way to put this is that we are in a society that is moving toward datafication, right? Like everything is about data, and we're turning people into data. And I think the more we are able to resist that process of turning into data, we may be resisting the overarching change, right? Right, which I think is quite oppressive and with very dangerous implications.
All right. Gerry, thank you for coming on Collateral Banter. Appreciate you sharing time and talking about America and Baudrillard. I always learn so much after these episodes. So thanks for coming on, Gerry, and I appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure.
All right.